My name is Hayley. I'm the philanthropy officer here at Anthony Nolan. And today we wanted to get you all here to kind of update you on what your support has made possible, and how your support has helped us innovate and raise the bar for transplant care so that we can best serve people with blood cancer, blood disorders, as well as their families. I know that you're all supporters already, so you are fairly familiar with what we do, but just as a reminder of the full extent of the work that you help make possible. As an organization, we focus on what we call the 3 R's. So the first one is we're best known for creating the world's first stem cell register that helps matching stem cell donors to patients in desperate need of a stem cell transplant. Then we focus on research as well, to both help create better matches and better treatment options. And third, focus a lot on recovery. So that includes both supporting and advising patients and their families, including grants and emotional support. And of course, our nurses, including our clinical psychologists and clinical nurses who help patients directly in transplant centers across the country. And that's where we're here today. And we'll focus on that patient services aspect. And I will hand over directly to Rachel, who is our lead nurse here at Anthony Nolan. And she'll tell you more about what her team does. And then we'll hear from one of our clinical psychologists directly as well. And before I do that, sorry, Rachel, I forgot to say, the chat is open for everyone to ask questions. And we really encourage that because it's not every day you get to hear directly from Rachel or from our clinical psychologist. If you're a bit more shy, feel free to message me directly, and we'll go over any questions afterwards, but don't feel like you have to wait until the end before you send that question. We don't want you to forget it. Yeah, that's everything from me. I'll hand over to Rachel.
Thank you, Ellie. Hello, everyone. I'm Rachel Miller. I'm the lead nurse here at Anthony Nolan. I've met a couple of you, I think, face to face. But for those that don't know you, my main role here is to act as a conduit, I guess, between Anthony Nolan and our healthcare professionals out in the transplant centres, also contributing to kind of the clinical expertise of the patient services team, etc. I've just got a few slides to demonstrate what we do. Let me see if I can talk and share screen at the same time. Bear with me. Hopefully, any second now, you'll see the first slide come up. Is it there, Ellie? I can see your face. Fab. So yes, many of you will obviously know what we do as a charity already, and we have a huge operational place within stem cell transplant for our register and providing donors, etc. But as Eddie's already mentioned, we very much look at patient recovery as well, and that's an awful lot of what patient services does. And whilst we look at recovery, we actually look at the whole stem cell transplant journey. So aims of our patient services team is really to support everyone affected by transplant, making sure that patients are kept at the heart of what we do, continually enhancing our offer. And the part of my job that I talked about already is ensuring our relationship with those hospital teams remains collaborative and mutually beneficial. And of course, working towards the wider strategic organisational priorities. But I think what's really important to mention is that we're here for patients before they might even know that they are definitely going to have a stem cell transplant. And that's where our patient information comes in to help people understand what a stem cell transplant is, even actually, and it's on a later slide, what a stem cell is. Because when you're first taken into that clinic room to be told you need to have this procedure, it's language that perhaps many patients have never heard of before. And I think the really important thing to mention here is that we support anyone connected with transplant. And so we're not just looking at the patient, we're looking at the whole family, social group surrounding that patient. And we'll take questions and interactions with anyone affected, as well as obviously our healthcare professionals. So I just mentioned there about our information range. We have a huge amount of information, as I said, from starting out thinking about having a stem cell transplant right through to recovery and late effects monitoring, etc. after transplant. There's just a few of the booklets. Many of you may have seen these before, but this is part of my role as well, contributing to our information team, making sure that our information in these booklets is up to date. And I work with our healthcare professionals who will act as peer reviewers for these as well, so that we have our in-hospital healthcare professionals also involved in this, as well as patients as well, actually. In addition to all of our written information here, we also have lots of information on our website, patient stories, blogs. We have peer support through our forum, but we also have our inquiry line, which can be via email or the telephone line, all of which I help to contribute to the clinical inquiries that come through. And just to mention, I think one of the aims there was to continually enhance our offer. And just as a example of how we don't stand still for long, sickle cell stem cell transplants for adults were commissioned just a couple of years ago, and we're in the process now of putting together a package of information for those patients specifically, because entering a stem cell transplant when you have sickle cell is very different to perhaps entering a stem cell transplant when you've got a malignant blood disorder like leukemia, for example. And just because we're very excited by the new translation tool on the website, which hasn't been out, just wanted to highlight that to you, that I think there's probably pushing up to 100 languages now available on the website, so that people that don't speak English as their first language or don't read English very well can have the opportunity to change the language on the website, which is really brilliant. Just wanted to mention as well that Patient Services offers grants to patients and their families, anyone affected by a stem cell transplant, and that goes beyond just allogeneic stem cell transplants where you might need to have a donor, be it your sibling or an unrelated donor. This is also available for autograft patients, so people that have their own stem cells back. And this is a really valuable grant for patients who perhaps have increased travel costs and all the other things that come with having to travel a long way to specialist transplant centres. And just to mention that we've just this last 10 days introduced a new £150 winter recovery payment for people that apply for a grant, and that's really to address the increasing energy prices, etc., knowing that people are going to spend an awful lot more heating their homes over winter, etc., food, all the other things that are increasing due to the cost of living. And this next slide just illustrates to you what the money gets spent on. I mentioned travel there because many of our patients are travelling up to 100 miles round trip, if not more, to get to specialist centres for their appointments. So travel is our biggest request for a grant. But we've got all sorts of things there, you know, down to perhaps someone needing a better grade fridge because of needing to make sure that they have a diet that is healthy, that reduces the risk of any food poisoning, bits and pieces like that. Yeah, all sorts of things, but just gives you an illustration of the grants that we've awarded over the last financial year. And just going back to what I said about our website having lots of information, it's not just about the clinical things. We also have blogs and information from patients about how they've used our support services, really trying to, I guess, remove the stigma of having to apply for a grant. We're really proactive in people making use of these grants, etc. But moving on to the bit you're all here for, which is working with healthcare professionals. We, as you may be aware, have had a funded programme in place since 2014, and that started with 3 clinical nurse specialists in transplant centres around the UK. We tried and tested it, it worked really well, and since then we have on average funded 2 to 4 posts every year. You can see the lovely Hayley, Kelly, and I can't see the other person who's there, Janet, on Nurses Day this year, all getting bunches of flowers from Anthony Nolan to say thank you for their work. So to date we have had 16 nurse posts funded and 7 clinical psychology posts. In 2019 with the success of the CNS posts, the nurse specialist posts, we extended out into psychology. And we've got Jenna, one of our funded psychologists, here today to talk to you once I finish explaining all this, so you'll be able to hear direct from her about the work she does. But these nurses particularly provide emotional and practical support to patients who otherwise would not have a dedicated person as a point of contact after transplant. Many of them set up nurse-led clinics looking at late effects, thinking about things like secondary cancer screening and all the other higher risk problems that occur following having a stem cell transplant. So just someone there that's really on the individual side. And our clinical psychologists will see patients throughout the pathway, not just in recovery, though they will see people beyond their stem cell transplant and into recovery, which a lot of patients don't get access to if they don't have an Anthony Nolan psychologist in their service. And this just outlines those posts that we have funded to date, 23 in total, I think, if you were to count around the map. We have just this year funded 4 new posts. 2 are very traditional, following a similar model to what we've had before, with a adult clinical psychologist going into Leeds and a paediatric specialist nurse going into Birmingham. But we also have a prehab nurse starting in Manchester, which is really exciting. That's looking at recovery before the patient even starts their stem cell transplant, thinking about getting them in the best possible shape before they even hit transplant. And we also have a non-malignant post-transplant specialist nurse coming into post, because what we are aware of, and many of you will have heard about, inequalities in transplant across the country anyway, and that's the exact point of what we're trying to do, is trying to flatten out those inequalities so that everyone gets the same access to care. But if you are a malignant stem cell transplant patient, so for example have leukemia or another cancer, you may have the opportunity to have more access to services than perhaps someone that doesn't have a cancer. And that's just the way funding has happened with things like Macmillan and lots of other charities that surround cancer, but perhaps don't surround the other blood disorders that stem cell transplant is a treatment for. So that's a really exciting, innovative post that we're looking forward to funding as we go forward. And then just to mention how the clinical education works. So one of my roles is also to provide study days or highlight learning opportunities to our healthcare professionals, not just those affiliated to the charity, but all healthcare professionals working in stem cell transplant, trying to work to develop guidelines so that, again, inequalities in how patients are cared for are ironed out in different transplant centres. We encourage our funded posts to think about sharing any service developments they've had, etc. And you can see on the screen there an EBMT poster. That's the European Bone Marrow Transplant Conference that some of our staff took to last year's conference. And we also aim to pull together guidelines and resources for healthcare professionals. You can see there our best effort trying to uncomplicate the COVID-19 vaccines for immunocompromised patients, because it was confusing. So just some examples of how else we share the knowledge that we gain as a charity and from our healthcare professionals. That's me finished talking for now. I am going to hand you over to Jenna.
Did we lose Rachel? Rachel?
She looks like she might be frozen.
She looks like she might be frozen. I was going to say we could address the 2 questions in the chat now, but I think let's just keep them for later, if that's okay. Keep them coming though. That's great. Thank you. Hayley?
Hi. That was kind of good timing that Rachel had finished talking when she suddenly froze.
Right.
Not too bad. Hi everyone, thanks for joining, and to Jenna, who's joined us to talk about her work today. We were going to be joined by David, who's been through a transplant, and he's been supported by Jenna, but he's not well, unfortunately. So he's very kindly said that Jenna can talk through like some of the ways they've worked together and how she supported him. But yeah, I've got a few questions for Jenna, but as Ellie said, please do put questions in the chat, because Jenna's very happy to answer questions at the end. So I think, is everybody else muted? I just always want to double check if you could mute yourself, just because if you're not muted and there's background noise, then suddenly your face appears on the screen instead of Jenna. So it's just always best to check. So I guess, Jenna, it'd be great if you could, rather than me trying to introduce you, introduce yourself and what you do with Anthony Nolan and why you've joined us for the webinar today.
Brilliant, happy to. Good morning, everybody. I'm very slight apologies in advance in that they've just decided to deliver some new MRI suite opposite where I am in the hospital, and the whole building has just been shaking with the noise. So I'm hoping that I can fit in between the noise that's been happening and that the sound quality is okay for everybody. So good morning, my name is Jenna Love and I'm a clinical psychologist and I work at St George's Hospital, which is in South London. And as Hayley and Rachel have said, I am funded by Anthony Nolan. So our service at St George's has always had a cancer psychological support team, or at least since 2016. So we've always been able to offer a level of psychological support to the people having a stem cell transplant because of cancer. But what we've never been able to do before, we've not been funded to see, exactly as Rachel was saying, to see any of the people who are having a transplant for other reasons. Because of aplastic anemia, we've got quite a busy programme for people having transplants for multiple sclerosis. We're one of the trial sites for people having transplants for sickle cell disease. So the sort of having the funding has meant that I'm additional. I'm an extra person in the service, and I can work with people all the way through the transplant journey. So often I will meet people at pre-transplant at that sort of stage, often when they've relatively recently been diagnosed, if it's a blood cancer, and can work with them if needed throughout the transplant and afterwards. And I often find that actually the period afterwards is quite psychologically challenging as well. And there's no time limit to the time since transplant that I can see somebody. So actually I've had quite a few referrals of people who are 5, 6, 7, 8 years post-transplant, and that for them can be one of the most psychologically challenging times when perhaps issues with fertility or late effects are coming up.
Thanks, Jenna. That was brilliant. I think, as you mentioned, I think it's fantastic that this service exists for anyone going through a transplant now, because what we've learned from speaking with patients is that the transplant itself and the treatment and the recovery is so unique, and it is challenging in lots of ways. And as you said, it can take many years for some people. So it's amazing that support is there, that continuity is there to help people navigate it. And so I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about some of the psychological difficulties that people might face at different stages of that transplant process.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the first thing to say is that for a lot of people, the context of being told about a stem cell transplant is obviously in the context, normally, not always, but for a lot of people is in the context of a diagnosis of a blood cancer. And for a lot of people, that is a huge shock. It's, and actually this is something David, the patient who was going to come today, and he's ever so sad that he's not able to be here and really sends his apologies, but talks about that shock of that diagnosis and sitting in A&E as he's in his early 30s now, so at the time he would have just been at sort of probably just turning 30, to have that shock of the diagnosis and the language that was used at that time. And so I think people are already at that pre-transplant stage. Often they've had long periods of time in hospital. They've often had some chemotherapy, side effects. so they're already starting to feel the impact of this. And then people start to talk about a stem cell transplant. And I think that process, because the messaging that a lot of people get is, this is your best chance. This is the thing that medically we can do to maximize your chance of survival, but it's risky. And it's not only risky at the time, but it's also long-term side effects. And often people might have lots of conversations about that, but they definitely have a very long conversation before they come in, where they have to sign consent forms. They have to agree that they commit to this process. And the thing that almost universally people talk about is really significant fear, anxiety, worry, sadness, tearfulness, anger sometimes. And so I think a lot of what I'm doing at that pre-transplant stage is, sort of being that opportunity to talk to people, where a lot of people say to me that they don't necessarily want to, they talk a lot to friends and family, obviously. They know that their spouse is just as worried that they are, or their parents or their children are just as worried as they are. And so some of the things that they might want to talk about might be, what happens if I don't survive this? What happens if something goes wrong? And that having someone separate to talk to about that, someone who is not on the medical side of things, doesn't have to talk about drugs and blood test results, that having that space and being able to really get to know that person individually and think about what are the things that are the particular challenges. Are they someone who's always been sort of prone to worry and anxiety? And so that's going to be the biggest concern. And think about what skills and strategies are going to support them through this period and through this period of the transplant. Because a lot of the things that we all, use often might be going out for a drink, going to the gym, they're not possible when you're having treatment for cancer, when you're immunosuppressed. So we really have to get a bit creative about adding in some different coping strategies. So there's a lot of work pre-transplant. I do a mix of outpatient and inpatient. So I'm on the ward. That's a really important part for me, is actually being able to go and see people during the transplant and check in with how everything's going. And then I do a lot of work with people in that post-transplant transition stage, when actually they're starting to go back home, and the sort of the amazingness of being back home and being in their own bed and being able to eat their own food, but actually I'm still feeling really rubbish and I'm still really fatigued, and should I be better by now? And I still can't go out and see people, and what do I do about going back to work? And that stage, I think, can be just as psychologically challenging, and it might be a bit less about the anxiety and the fear, although there's still a lot of fear of, has this worked? But it's also more then about, how do I start to process what's happened? What's my identity if I'm not working, if I'm not able to care for my children in the same way? And so I think there's sort of different things that show up at different stages along the transplant journey for people.
Definitely. I think what you were saying there about how tailored it is to individuals, so not even tailored to their transplant and what they're going through, but them as a person, I think that's so valuable. And to have that at the very beginning, I imagine it must help people build a little bit of resilience that will actually help them navigate the transplant perhaps better than they would have without that support. I just wondered if you could share a little bit, you went into it slightly there, but how you work with people, what sessions are like, how many sessions you have, and the different ways that you support people.
It really varies, and I think it depends a little bit on when I get to meet somebody. But so, for example, David, who was going to join us today, had actually been referred to psychology, sort of a few months post his diagnosis, when he was just at that stage of starting to have the conversations about the stem cell transplant. So we had a bit of time to think about that idea, as you say, of building resilience. And I think it's I always say to people that it's incredibly normal to have these emotions, this fear, this anxiety, this apprehension. you know, we're not going to be able to get rid of that, but what we can hopefully do is reduce the impact of that. And that might look very different for different people. So particularly for David, it was thinking a little bit about things that he could do. So he'd always use things like walking and seeing his friends to manage his anxiety. Whereas when those things weren't available for him, actually, he had always been quite interested in things like mindfulness and meditation, and hadn't necessarily had time to pursue that. So for him, there was something quite helpful about going, right, I've got a little bit of time, didn't plan on having this time, but I've got this time. I'm going to be in hospital for a while. Let's actually experiment with some of these ideas with you know, sort of using some relaxation and some mindfulness approaches. So it really varies in terms of, you know, for other people, it might be more thinking about, you know, for a lot of people, it's actually dealing with procedures, fear of nausea, fear of, you know, injections and lines and all of those sorts of things. So there's sometimes some exposure work we can do beforehand so that people feel a bit prepared. And sometimes it's supporting the communication with the team. So actually they know that they can come in and see the room where they're going to be and actually meet the ward nurses and start to build that relationship and the trust that they have in the people who are going to support them through this process.
That's so valuable, isn't it, from what you were saying before about how much uncertainty there is around a transplant and the risks, to at least have the bits that you can control and almost, yeah, prepare people a little bit, like in the ways that you can. I was wondering if you could share a little bit about, you know, obviously we talk a lot about the physical impact of a stem cell transplant and the side effects and how it physically impacts someone. I wondered how the psychological side actually has an impact on recovery and how those sort of interlink.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's hugely important. And I think it's, you know, obviously the psychological side is really important because it's horrible to experience those emotions. We want to support people. We want to minimize that additional distress. But we see it having a really direct impact on people's physical well-being as well. I think just that slide that Rachel popped up earlier was somebody who'd had a transplant, I think, talking about how they were so anxious that they weren't able to sleep at night. And when we think about the fact that when people come in for their transplant, and even before, we're putting them through some really challenging physical experiences. It's, you know, it's a grueling treatment. And if you're not able to sleep because of psychological distress, that makes everything so much more harder to tolerate. You know, people talk very commonly about the impact on their appetite and not being, you know, feeling so low or feeling so anxious that they lose their appetite. And we know that nutrition is something that's hugely important, and good nutrition before and during transplant. And so if people are not sleeping well, if they're not, you know, managing to eat, if they're not managing to sort of move around in the way that we would want them to, because of psychological distress, actually that's going to make things a little bit harder physically during their transplant. And we see it post-transplant as well. So as I'm sure people are aware, there's a high demand post-transplant for people to be coming back to the hospital regularly to keep up with some quite tricky kind of drug regimes. And if people are feeling really low or their sleep patterns all over the place because of distress, actually then they perhaps going to find it more difficult to be taking their tablets on time. We've had, sadly, a couple of occasions of people who've not managed to make it to their follow-up appointments, and then physical side effects have really escalated very quickly. So it's important for the person's, you know, sort of well-being and their journey, but it's also really important for the physical side of things. There's some preliminary evidence that suggests that things like depression might even have an effect on engraftment, you know, and how quickly people, you know, are able to use the stem cells to start making their own, for the body to do their own process. So I think if there's anything like that we can do to try and support this process, then it's incredibly important for us to do that for all of those reasons, the potential benefit on all of those areas.
And what I think is amazing about like the support that you offer, Jenna, is it, like, with obviously the medical side of the transplant, you are reliant on the treatment and the medicine and the care from the team, but you can actually empower people to, when you're not there, do some of these things for themselves. And like you're saying about David with meditation and things. So do you see that, where people kind of, through working with you, they take on different things that they can do in their own time to help?
Definitely. And that can be really practical. That can be something very tangible, like, you know, I've integrated a meditation practice in my day, and I find that really helpful. But I always say that I think psychology works best when it's not only a safe space and a conversation that feels helpful at the time, but that it allows people to shift and for things to change in between sessions, and for people to feel like they can do things differently. You mentioned that word control earlier, and I think having, one of the things that I think David would talk about if he was here was about that sense of feeling like he felt more empowered and more in control to have those conversations, or even just to feel more confident in his ability to cope with the whole process. And I think that can be from some of the conversations that might be less about very tangible things that people can do, but it might be about actually looking at their way of seeing the situation and thinking about if there's particular kind of unhelpful ideas or stories or beliefs that people were holding, and being able to explore them and challenge them and sort of check that out in lots of ways, so that people's sort of perspective can shift, and that can be really powerful.
And I think another thing that we've talked about before is the impact more widely, you know, on people's relationships, on their relationships with their family, and how does the work that you do with people help the wider sort of social support network that they have?
I think one of the things I see coming up so much is so much mind reading and so much love and concern and protection. We're going, I don't want to talk to them about that because I'll worry them. And then the loved one, the family member is going, I don't want to talk to them about that because I can't say that to that person. And so we can take referrals for family members, carers, loved ones, just as much as we can for patients. And what we can often do, because I sit within a broader psychological cancer service, is that actually sometimes what we do is I might work with one person in that dyad, and one of my colleagues might work with the other person separately, but sometimes we might come together, and really just helping people to express and talk about what they really want to be talking about, but doing that in a safe and controlled way, so that it doesn't feel like it's going to overwhelm them, or they're going to get into conversations that are just too difficult that they then don't know where to go with that. Having it in, you know, an environment with psychologists alongside them can help people regulate their emotions and get to where they want to go with those conversations.
That's brilliant. I didn't realise that you could offer that to family and friends as well. And just because you started talking about it there a little bit, it'd be great to hear about how you work within a team and to offer that holistic support for one person.
Yeah, and I think actually that's one of the things that I really enjoy and I think is really valuable. So one of the things about me being embedded means that I only do stem cell transplant work, and that means that I am really present within the team. So I go to the teams. So when we're talking about the team, we're talking about the consultants, the nurses, also the pharmacists, the physios, the dietitians. And so I go to their multidisciplinary meetings. And the really important thing about that for me is that I don't think psychology should just be the domain of the psychologists. I think that actually we want to try and work towards this place where all of the care that we deliver is psychologically minded. And, you know, sort of Rachel was talking earlier about the nurses, and the CNSs do such an amazing job. They also hold a lot of distress and a lot of anxiety. And so one of the things that we do is actually offer training and supervision for the CNSs in our service and across the cancer at the trust, so that actually we equip them with some, you know, sort of psychological skills, and then we help them think about managing some of the more difficult emotional work that comes up. So that there might be some people who never come to see me, but hopefully through my presence in the team, there might be that kind of stepped care approach of benefiting just from psychological ways of thinking. And it goes both ways, because then I learn so much from them and the consultants, so that when they're talking about different protocols or GVHD, I know what that means, and that helps my knowledge and my work with patients as well.
That's brilliant, because I think, again, from speaking with patients, one of the things that's really helpful is speaking with someone about the psychological side of things who gets stem cell transplants. So having you there as a specialist who also has that team, so that you're aware of all of the sort of medical bits, it means that people don't have to explain things. They can just talk about how they're feeling, which I think must be really, really valuable for people. And well, obviously we would have had David here today to really show the impact, but I was wondering if you could give some examples of the impact that you've seen, you know, the changes that you've seen people go through and the positive impact that having this support has made.
Yeah, I think it's sort of, can see it at all of those different points of the pathway, actually. And I think I've worked with some people who genuinely I've not been sure will be able to turn up on the day for their transplant, because their anxiety and fear is so significant, particularly about the isolation, and being able to spend time with them in the run up to the transplant and think about the support and strategies and what we can put in place, and say, right, I will come and see you on day 1 and I will come and see you on day 5. I actually think for some people it has made the difference in them turning up and being able to feel like they can manage a transplant. What I think for a lot of other people is that it's hopefully made the process a lot more tolerable. It's never going to be easy, but that idea of, I talk about with additional distress, that the physical stuff, you know, we sort of manage the side effects as well as possible for people, that we also manage the psychological impact as well as possible. And I think if people feel in control, they feel like they've got some strategies, they know what's coming, actually that process can just be a tiny bit less distressing psychologically. And I've definitely had some people who I felt like we might have just managed to prevent some, you know, sort of issues post-transplant, in terms of, you know, we do see post-traumatic stress disorder post-transplant. We see a lot of people who struggle to integrate what's happened and have nightmares and flashbacks and things. And so I think there's some people that we've been able to recognize when they're starting to head in that direction, and actually stop and pause and think about what we need, what support we need to put in place. So I think there are, you know, and then the examples from the post-transplant work are very clear in terms of some of the significant depression that comes up that is otherwise not necessarily recognised, not necessarily treated. And that can be a multidisciplinary approach. It can involve, you know, our psychiatrist and medication and support from the team as well. But actually being able to have quick access to psychological support. And again, as you say, somebody who understands fatigue, chronic pain, GVHD, these sorts of things, to be able to reassure people that actually there's things that we can do about this, and that we can actually bring some improvements to their situation.
Thank you, Jenna. I mean, I could talk to you for ages. It's clear to me how important and valuable these roles are, and how much, you know, we've loved for every patient to have access to something like this. So on that note, I'm going to hand back over to Rachel now, who can talk a little bit more about, I think, the services and the future that we would like for them. Thanks, Jenna.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jenna. It's fantastic. Sorry about my abrupt disappearance earlier. Hopefully I'll stay long enough to talk to you for a bit longer. I am just going to share my screen once more just to show you a couple more slides. So Jenna's obviously giving you a really good insight into her role and how she works with patients, but I just wanted to mention to you that they do more than just direct patient care. They work really closely with us as a charity, and with their peers and colleagues across the UK to raise awareness of the roles. And one of the things that we're really proud of with these funded roles is, whilst they are delivering direct patient care in the hospital, there is a ripple effect that comes from them. And when other hospitals see the impact that they are having, and we're able to share that through things like the posters at EBMT or at conferences, presentations, etc., it just helps to raise practice everywhere. And so I'd say that's one of the most wonderful things about these roles, is that we are able to indirectly impact patients across the UK by encouraging other hospitals to consider these roles. And just a couple of insights into things. So the lovely Jenna, it was World Mental Health Day this time last week, I think, and Jenna had an Instagram live for us, obviously going with modern times and showing people how we do things via a slightly different medium. We have worked together on a podcast for another charity looking to raise awareness of the register, and you can see in the bottom corner there one of our funded nurses and one of our funded psychologists at Bristol Children's Hospital getting involved in a photo shoot for us, just to try and help raise awareness and visualize who these people are and what they're doing. And here on this slide, you can see just very small in the bottom corner there, an end of funding report. So for every funded post that we have, we collect data on who they're seeing and what they're doing with those patients every month. And we use that data along with patient experience information and peer and colleague experience, perhaps questionnaires, etc., to really pull together a robust report at the end of the funded period to show the impact that that post has had on the patients in the transplant centre, with the aim then that the NHS Trust will take over the funding for that post. And as I said earlier, we have recruited 16 specialist nurses and 7 clinical psychologists over the course of our funded programme so far. Some are still in funded with us and some are only just starting, but of those that have completed their funding, we've managed to convert every single one into an NHS role, bar one, and that was because there was a trust merger going on at the time. The role did continue, but in a slightly different job description. But I think that's a really good conversion rate from our funded posts into NHS roles, and just shows how valuable they are deemed to be by the transplant centres. And then just a few stats here for this year so far, giving you an insight into how many patients have been as nurses and our clinical psychologists. So thank you very, very much. I think Ellie's going to open up to questions now.
Thank you so much, Rachel. Great. So thank you so much. Oh, can you hear me? My mic is doing things. Great. Thanks so much, Douglas, for your questions. These are great. I think maybe let's start with the ones you asked initially. So the first one is, how do you contact patients to disseminate your information? And I think the second one connects quite closely. So how do you assess the financial circumstances of patients to work out what grant they might receive?
I assume that one's for me. So we have a patient and family Facebook page where we put lots of information out. We also have a newsletter that goes out to patients and families that are registered with us, which is fantastic, but really we're only disseminating information to the people that we're already disseminating information to. And so our healthcare professionals, Jenna and our others, are really, really important in filtering out that information into the patient community, so that they might see Jenna about psychology, but she will also signpost them to many other of our patient resources. And the other thing that we're just embarking on, actually, which is fairly hot off the press, but we are doing a roadshow of UK transplant centres and referring hospitals within patient services a very ambitious plan to hit about 150 hospitals by the end of 2023. And that is purely to get information out to healthcare professionals so that they can then disseminate it out to the patients. So yeah, that's really exciting. And the grants, we have a grants panel that's made up of a former patient and 2 or 3 Anthony Nolan employees from across the charity. The applications come from healthcare professionals on behalf of the patient who have to endorse the request. There are some stipulations. I think if you're in a couple, you have to have savings under £8,000, and if you're single, savings under £6,000. But beyond that, there's not much else that stipulates whether or not you can have a transplant, as long as your healthcare professional has endorsed the application.
Thank you for that. And I've just seen your latest message. That's very interesting. And it's obviously a shame that that link wasn't made obvious. Anthony Nolan was directly involved with helping find that match. Clearly we can, do some work on making that more clear. And I don't have much more information of that, but we would love to speak to you more afterwards about this, because like Rachel said and Jenna, it's never too late to get that support. So even though I understand it's a little too late, we're still here, and there's not a time limit on when we can provide that. So I will speak to you afterwards in more detail. In the meantime, another question that came in, I don't know if you can see it in the chat, but it's, can you expand please on the importance and potential of any other specific prehab interventions as a patient support community, such as dietary, ahead of the tough treatments, and what else would Anthony Nolan ideally like to be doing more of in this space?
Yeah, so anyone that's aware of the prehab model, it's been used for a long time, particularly in cancer surgery, and is moving into other oncology settings and having great success. And so we recognise it's a real, it would be a real asset in the stem cell transplant journey. Some of the problem with stem cell transplant is that you can be put into that pathway very, very quickly, and perhaps don't have the lead up to get someone in the perfect shape for transplant. But there are many patients that do have time, and in doing that, you get the opportunity to think about exactly what the question says there about the diet, exercise, the psychological support that might be needed, etc. It's just a really good way of holistically assessing someone and getting them in the best shape possible for all of those different arms before they go into transplant. We have, I didn't put it on the map actually, but one of our innovation roles in the last couple of years was to fund a physiotherapist at Cardiff in their new prehab model. And that's part funded, part research really, because they're looking at a small study at how the impact of prehab on patients that go through their prehab model. So they're taking 100 patients through to see what the outcome is, and we've helped, well, through help with funding, we've been able to assist in that innovation. And next year, one of our big priorities is looking at prehab information, so that patients and healthcare professionals have something to refer to within our information suite.
Perfect, thank you. Please, if the question isn't answered the way in the detail you would like, please let me know. But otherwise, I didn't forget your other question, Douglas, which is, how does Anthony Nolan work with the other registers of potential donors? And I think the best person to answer this here would be Julian, our head of philanthropy. Please jump in, Jules.
Yeah, hi, great question. Yeah, because obviously all of the registers sort of work together really closely. We have a sort of combined target within the UK to try and improve the register and make sure we can provide as many matches as possible. Though Anthony Nolan acts as the source for finding matches for patients. So all of those requests from hospitals come to us, and we will look across the UK register, but we also look worldwide for those matches straight away. So actually we're working really closely with all of the registers around the world, both on a practical level in terms of finding matches for patients, but also on a sort of strategic and support level through something called the World Marrow Donors Association. And we're involved in helping registers around the world sort of improve their services in their countries. So for example, we're working really closely with a register called DATRI in India at the moment, and that will have a great effect for patients in India, but will also have a great effect for patients from a sort of Indian background in the UK, because we can map sort of populations across. So we know that if, you know, somebody from a South Indian background in Leicester needs a transplant, we know that we can work closely with DATRI to improve the chances of them finding the best match, for example. So yeah, we're all friends and all doing the best we possibly can for as many patients as we possibly can.
Thanks, Jules. And follow-up question, why do so many donors come from Germany? Just a good observation.
It is a good observation. I don't know whether I'm telling you the exact answer to this, but I have heard comments from German donors basically saying, yeah, everybody does it. It's been the case for so long that everyone's aware of signing up, and it's sort of, you know, why wouldn't you? And it's which seems a really great attitude to me.
Definitely something we aspire to, or a level that we aspire to reach, with our efforts to grow the register and diversify it. So hopefully that will be us. Am I missing any questions? There was another one that was sent to me privately, actually. Do you have to overcome, this is more for Jenna, I suppose. Do you have to overcome any resistance to psychological support with people being nervous or thinking it's a sign of failure or weakness?
That's such a good question. I think, yes, definitely still. And I think this is something where the team are really supportive and present psychology as a very normal thing. And I think for some people still there is a power or a respect that if my consultant has suggested it and my consultant has suggested that it's a good thing to do and said, look, this is really tough, we would like you to see our psychologist, then I think that holds a lot of weight. What we often say to people, there's no pressure, nobody has to talk to me, but what we often say is just meet Jenna, just try, and often I'm around, I might be on the ward or I might be on the day unit, and so people can literally just introduce me. I'm somebody who's part of the team. It's not a referral to a mental health trust at a different hospital that's off-site. So I think there are things that we do that we try and really normalize the role of psychology in the way that we would refer to physio, we would refer to dietitian and say that this is a support. But if people are really not keen, then that's up to them, and we might think about, you know, sort of other forms of support. They might link in with, you know, sort of the patient and family forum. They might find their own kind of buddy system of people who've been through a transplant. But yeah, there is still, and I will spend some time sort of talking about what I am and I'm not. You know, I'm not a psychiatrist. You won't lie on a couch. I don't read your mind. You know, sort of, if one of the things I really like about this is that I get to meet people who would probably never have come anywhere near psychology. And so it's really normal to be a bit apprehensive and to not be sure exactly what it looks like. But normally, most of the time, once people meet me and realize that I'm relatively normal, that sort of allays a lot of their fears.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It's just an extra obstacle to have to overcome for the best. I think unless anyone else wants to jump in, and feel free to unmute yourselves and ask any of us a direct question, Otherwise, one that I think as a good way to end is just plans for the future and kind of immediate or short-term challenges that this program might be facing. Yeah.
That for me, Ellie. Yeah.
Probably.
So plans for the future, we'd like to get bigger. We had our funded applications for this year opened in April. We took applications up to June, or end of May. We had our panel in June. We had 18 applications for 15 different hospitals. That tells you the need that's still out there, that there's still requests coming in. To give you some perspective, there are approximately 24 adult centres in the UK and probably a further 10 paediatric centres that deliver allogeneic stem cell transplants. So although we've hit nearly 23 posts, we by no means have hit every allo centre in the UK. A nice problem to have is that these posts often uncover other things that the team want to do. So very often our specialist nurses will do a fantastic job in setting up clinics, etc., and then say, oh, but it would be amazing if we could have a psychologist, or because they're fantastic roles independently, but they're even better if they work in the team, as Jenna's mentioned, that whole holistic team working together, rather than perhaps a sticking plaster for bits of the journey. We have yet to apply for NHS funding in this post-COVID era. I think that potentially could be a challenge. I think trusts are going to want a little bit more impact analysis. They will really want to know they're spending their money well than perhaps they did prior to COVID. Everywhere is struggling financially. And then I think the other thing is, we saw in COVID particularly, but winter pressures happen every year, and perhaps more for the nursing roles. So I think Jenna probably will see this with having to cross-cover colleagues, etc. Often you get pulled from your role into what's most critical in a hospital, and when the beds are full and people are calling in sick, etc. The immediate care of patients in those hospital beds is what counts, and so that can impact on delivery of the service from our funded posts. But on the whole, we always seem to manage and deliver a report that proves impact, so we'll find a way through the challenges. Hope that answers the question.
I think it does, and I think our supporters can definitely inquire if they need more information, and yeah, we always want to be very transparent with everything that we do. So yeah, looking forward to hearing from anyone directly with any follow-up questions. You have my contact details. We will follow up with a recording afterwards, and obviously if you feel free to share it with anyone that you think might be interested, want to share, spread the word, and yeah, make sure that no one feels left out and that everyone can find a match. So unless there's any last questions, thank you all so much for coming.